Discover the Our MedTech Lives podcast, where industry experts share their career stories, key achievements, and insights into overcoming challenges in the medtech field. Hosted by Zilko Rima and Kash Ikram.
Today, we are really honored to welcome Pete Schommer. Pete Schommer has had an illustrious career in the medical device business, having spent almost 18 years at Vision, then Medtronic, in several key leadership business positions, before taking his experience to a wider arena, becoming a consultant and board member and helping companies bring their early-stage innovative products to market. Without further ado, welcome to our MedTech Lives, Pete.
Well, thanks, Kash. It's very nice to be here.
Hi, Pete. Before we start talking about your MedTech career, we want to get to know you a little better. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, where you grew up, where you studied, how you started your career? We know it's not in MedTech. Let's start with.
Yes, so I grew up about an hour north of Chicago, and I had a nice childhood. I graduated from high school, and we went to the United States Naval Academy. I had every intention and aspiration to spend a career in the United States Navy. I'm one of two kids. My sister's 2 years younger. She still lives in the Chicago area, and ironically, I have a family that is spread throughout MedTech. My brother-in-law is a doctor. His wife is with company Hollister, is in at a pretty significant position. My brother-in-law works in quality regulatory consulting after a career at Baxter. My parents were both veterans of Abbott Labs, so I've kind of grown up around this industry.
Wow.
And we know that you didn't start in MedTech, so what did you do before?
I didn't, no. So I mentioned I graduated from the United States Naval Academy, and I was what they call a surface warfare officer, which meant that I served on surface ships. I was on a Knox-class frigate out of Norfolk, Virginia for a couple of years, and then I was navigator on a destroyer out of Long Beach, California. Went to the Persian Gulf. I did some counter-drug operations down in the Caribbean. Had a really nice 6-year run, and then decided it was time to get out, start a family, and begin a business career.
Wow, what kind of job would be exciting after a start like that? That's pretty incredible.
It was a good 6 years.
Yeah, but I understand that the U.S. military has a really good program of helping officers and people to get into jobs after they leave the military, right? In your case, the Navy.
Yeah, so in the United States military, they have a number of different what they call officer accession programs. Could be ROTC, could be going to the service academies like I did. And usually they have about a 5 or 6 year commitment to staying on active duty. And then the military really doesn't need everyone to stay beyond 5 or 6 years. So there's a kind of a natural break point at which there's this population of really talented, educated, experienced. We've led people in stressful situations. Most of us have been overseas.
Yes.
We're pretty good with technical topics, etc. So there's a kind of a cottage recruiting industry that specializes in attracting junior officers that want to leave the military and placing them into the careers, into business. So I went through one of those companies. I went to a hiring conference in Atlanta. It's like student dating. You had 8 1-hour interviews in 10 hours. So you got a little bit of a break here and there between them. And then you got callbacks. And at the end of that, I ended up with a job offer to join this little $600 million primarily domestic company called Kendall back in the late 1990s.
Fantastic. And so this is a recurring theme that comes up in our podcast, is using those transferable skills that you have. Right. And those transferable skills are the gateway into the medical device industry, right? So like many others, you didn't have a medical background. I mean, you grew up around it, but you didn't study medicine or biology or anything like that, right?
No, in fact, I can remember getting in an argument with my father back in college about how immoral it was to make money off of helping people get well. It's a funny thing. 5 years later, I ended up working for Kendall, selling gauze and urine meters and drain bags.
Fantastic. So did you start in sales then?
No, I started in supply chain, in forecasting and distribution planning.
And that was, again, taking your skills that you'd learned from the Navy over to the company, right? Is that?
Yeah, basic organizational skills, how to communicate, how to stay on top of things, a little bit of math.
All that good stuff, right? Fantastic.
I think one of the things that you learn in the Navy is you have to be a generalist. You can't have somebody aboard ship who's in potential position to take command of the ship who doesn't at least have a surface level understanding of how everything works and how everything works together. I think that's probably the most transferable skill set I brought over from the Navy to coming to work for healthcare.
Yeah. I have one question, pure curiosity.
Mhm.
What was the longest trip you spent away from home?
We were gone away from home for a little over 6 months when we left in October of 1994 to go over to the Persian Gulf, and we came back at the end of April of 1995.
Wow. Bit longer than my trip then. I think it was 3 weeks.
Yes.
You see, don't complain. And that's
Yeah, I'm not going to.
Pete, can you tell us a little bit or walk us a little bit through your career in the MedTech industry then? Because it was a very impressive pathway. This is what we know.
Yes. So over the years, when people kind of ask, how are you successful? I say, well, some of this is what you can control. So be good, work hard, take advantage of every opportunity that you have, study, et cetera. And then some of it is just timing and being in the right place. So I joined in 1997 in absolutely the right time and right place to be part of Kendall. So at the time, Tyco had bought them a year beforehand. And they were this domestic company that had about $600 million in revenue. International was going to Canada and down into Mexico. So it was really a primarily domestic focused company. And over the next 3 years, they went on a slew of acquisitions. They bought Sherwood Davis and Geck, which gave them needles and syringes and sutures. Shortly after that, they bought U.S. Surgical, which brought them into the surgery business, staplers, access devices, merging the two suture lines together. Not long after that, they bought Mallinckrodt, and the company just grew by leaps and bounds. And so, between 1997 and say 2001, the company went from $600 million to something like $4 billion in revenue, with almost half of that coming from overseas. So it was a very different organization. And my career kind of exploded along with that. So I got promoted up to inventory manager. Then I got an opportunity to come down to Connecticut to take over the whole planning function. So inventory control, forecasting, et cetera, for the surgical division. It was really a fantastic time and place to be. And then my boss got the opportunity to go out and run a more complex logistics organization. So I picked up the opportunity to become the VP of logistics and supply chain, all in that in about 8 years. So some of it is hard work and being in control of your destiny, doing what you can do on your part. And some of it is just, I was in absolutely the right place and at the right time.
And this was such a key role in when you're dealing with medical devices. The product has to be where the patient and the healthcare professionals need it at the right time. I mean, this sounds like around the time where just-in-time type delivery became quite popular and being used, right? And I know that I'm familiar with, you've got a patient coming in the next morning who needs X, Y, and Z. You call up the company before a certain time in the day, and there's an expectation that that product is available. Anything that's missing is delivered by 8, 9 a.m. the next morning, right? Ready for the patient, whether it be a hip implant, a knee prosthesis, some hernia mesh, or something like that. And that's essentially what you were doing, right?
Yeah, I was planning and managing the inventories on the side of the OEM. Most of the time that was feeding other warehouses, whether they were company owned, like sending them over to Europe or to Asia, or feeding them into distributors in the US. The distributor in the US kind of fits that JIT function that you're describing, where you can place an order as late as 7 o'clock in the evening, and it'll have on your receiving dock at 7 o'clock the next morning.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been there in the OR waiting for a knee component to arrive. And then it arrives just before they need it, and then it gets cemented in place. Yeah, I've been there. It raises your blood pressure a little bit, but it's always respected people like yourselves who are able to make that happen through long-term and short-term planning. It was pretty incredible sometimes. Fantastic.
Yes.
Very good. But then when I met you in Covidian, you were a commercial leader, right? So how did that happen?
So a couple of, again, some of this is timing and luck and being in the right place, and some of it is hard work. So I had decided to go back to school in 2004, and I enrolled in an executive MBA program at the University of Connecticut, and I picked up my MBA in 2000. And I thought that was an important step, to take some time to reinvest in myself, to acquire a broader skill set. I knew very well how we did things, but as we acquired other companies, I had come to realize that there were other ways of doing business and other ways of handling things from an accounting perspective, or how do we plan our distribution, et cetera. So the MBA kind of gave me this much more well-rounded view of how does a business operate and what are the choices that are available to a business leader on the table. And while all that happened, Tyco went through a real transformation. So there was the indictment of Dennis Kozlowski. He came in. Ed Breen took over as their CEO, coming in from Motorola. And after a couple of years of trying to lean Six Sigma and kind of re-engineer the whole company, came to the conclusion that what Tyco International was as a conglomerate really wasn't doing the best value of shareholders. And so they had to separate out into 3 different companies, one of which was going to be a pure healthcare play that became Covidien. And as we spun out of Covidien, it was really obvious that the strategy needed to change, that we needed to invest in new technologies. We needed to revitalize our R&D spending. We needed to become much more marketing and commercially driven sort of a company than what we had been my first 10 years with the organization, which was primarily a finance and manufacturing supply chain driven organization, looking for ways to drive EBITDA out. I can remember, I tell people that my very first R&D project that I worked on back in 1997 was, could we take a piece of gauze that was 20 strands by 10 strands per square inch and make it 17 strands by 7 strands per square inch and have nobody notice the difference in the marketplace because we could take out like 20% of the materials from doing it. That was R&D back at Kendall in the 90s. And then we truly needed to become an innovative company if we were going to survive and thrive on our own. And around that time, I was going through this career sort of crisis to say, I think in your career, you want to be in the spot where you think you can make the best difference. Back when I was in Annapolis, there was a debate. Did you want to fly airplanes? Did you want to be on submarines? Did you want to be on surface ships? Or did you want to be green? And we all had different takes, but we sort of gravitated towards what we felt we were best at. And that's where I was at it, in 2007 or so, from a career crossroads perspective. As this new company is coming out, what I do is still important. It's just not as important in the new strategy in the new company. And so did I really want to stay there and kind of become a second, tier or secondary support function? Or did I want to go to another company that was going to value that skill set? Or did I want to work on acquiring a new skill set and coming over commercial? So I was very fortunate in that my boss at the time offered me the opportunity to say, I think you have the capability of becoming a commercial person. Would you like to take that chance? Explored it first through some project work. I looked at a project around what would the proper design of the European sales channel look like. And then that led me to taking a position in business development and licensing, where I led mergers and acquisitions for the surgical division for about a 3-year period.
That's right. You did. Yes.
Yeah.
That was interesting.
I have a question. I'm curious about one thing. I mean, being in sales and marketing for my entire career in MedTech, we saw a lot of people joining this commercial team coming from finance or from supply chain, logistics, whatever. I have never seen someone from sales moving into logistics. Does that happen or not at all?
Try to think in my career, it might have happened. It's not a real common sort of a thing.
So why is sales so exciting that everyone wants to join the sales team?
Well, if you ask some people who work in some of the other roles, they may say, no, it's not that exciting. I think, I think that's when some people have a fear of, when you're facing the customer and you're being thrown all these challenges and you have to think on your feet, it's sometimes easier to be doing your role, which is inside the company, still contributing, but no one's asking you challenging questions or, angry with you because the product didn't work.
Delivering the message,
or the service wasn't great. So, it's nicer to have your boss be angry with you than a customer. I was fun. So maybe there's, but there have been people, but rarely people moving. I remember when the IT, we went with the IT revolution and we started to develop CRM systems, etc. A friend of mine, Jack, he moved into IT. He moved from sales into the IT organization. So it does happen the other way. I think I
think it's also a lifestyle thing because when you like being in the field, traveling, being outside, you might struggle with going to the office every day. I don't know. But
Yes.
it's just out of curiosity because you did this step. If you saw someone moving in the other direction.
Yes.
Well, where I see it a little bit, Silke, is more on the startup side. Where you'll find it very often that salesperson has either on their own come up with an idea, or maybe in partnership with a healthcare professional. They understand that there's a particular need that's not being met, or it's being met suboptimally, and then they want to found a company on that. So I see a lot more salespeople kind of in the founder role or co-founder role in these small companies. And then once they're in there, they have to acquire skill sets around how do I manage finance and inventory, fundraise, et cetera. But I don't see it so much in the big med tech companies that it's more specialized that way.
Yeah. There's interest when you're in a smaller company. Sometimes you have to be a jack of all trades, right?
You do.
And as a product engineer, you might get sent out with the sales rep to help make the sale. But in a large companies, it's more structured. You have to really express an interest and a desire, and have a boss who sees that potential in you, like you did, and go for it in that way. But it's definitely possible if you want to go in that direction, right?
It is absolutely possible.
Med device companies are typically, full of intelligent people and well funded, right? So the larger ones, there's all sorts of directions that you can go in, right? Once you're inside the company. It reminds me actually of a Dilbert cartoon, right? And I've got to explain it to you, right? You know, the little engineer in Dilbert cartoon, the sales rep arrives in a suit and says, I need you to help me make a sale. The next box is him, and the sales rep is saying, my company makes the best products in the world. And the other company employs engineers like him. Points to the Dilbert. And the final cartoon is Dilbert and the engineer with a coffee company saying, you made a sale? It's so good. Absolutely brilliant. Yes. Okay, so you got into the commercial side. So tell us your journey through the commercial side. Because when I came to work for you, you were vice president of the soft tissue suture business, right? Well, what was the journey you had before then?
So I did 3 years in business development and licensing, and that was a really interesting, informative period because prior to coming into that, I think I had the same or a similar perception that many folks do around mergers and acquisitions, that you get summoned because, the company has entered into an agreement to acquire somebody, and we need you to go out and kick the tires and make sure that everything is in order, the engine's running good, the body's in good shape, et cetera, before we close on the deal. And then the hard work of integrating that, taking that company apart and putting it back together again as part of your company. And so I had this perception that, we're doing all these deals all the time, and that we have 100% success rate. And what I learned was that you really don't have 100% success rate in negotiating these things. You sit down with the commercial teams, you get sort of here's a wish list of stuff that we would like to have that doesn't, either we don't have it in our portfolio and it's a gap, or we have something in our portfolio, but it's not as strong as somebody else's. Can we go buy them? And then you have to sit down and put together a business case and figure out, okay, well, if we owned them, what would this look like? How would it fit within the company? What's it worth for us? Because you're gonna have to pay them a premium to take them out. Then you've got to do all the deal negotiations. So there's a ton of fallout. The first kind of tier of the fallout is, can you even afford them? It doesn't make financial sense. And the second piece of that is, are they even available for sale? And are they willing to take the price that you can afford to pay them? Then you have to do the due diligence piece. And then at the end of it, the acquisition piece. So you really, by building these pro formas, it's almost like getting a capstone project in your MBA, right? You have to understand the accounting of it, the finance. How is the commercial part going to work? What are the operations going to look like? Are we keeping the salespeople? Are we not keeping the salespeople? What do we do with the physical inventory? What are we going to do with the manufacturing plan? You have to answer all these questions to put together the pro forma, and then you have to come to kind of crystallize that to saying, here's the couple of critical assumptions that have to be true when we go into due diligence. So it was really a good 3-year formative period. I did a couple of interesting deals. The Biomedical integration was my last deal, and Biomedical is the basis for the Insignia stapler that's on the market today, their powered stapler. But that was a really interesting deal that we did towards the end of my time. But we did a number of probably 15 or 20 different pro formas in a 3-year period that got pretty serious, and it was a good couple of years.
So just for our listeners who may not know what a powered stapler is, this is a device that cuts and staples tissue, right?
Yes.
And you can use it to chop out sections of a lung, for example, or a liver, or to take, if you have cancer in the lung, or if you have cancer in the liver, you can take those, and it will it will cut the tissue, but also staple either side of that cut. Just like a staple you get when you staple paper, right? But just not that big, much smaller. And that cuts off the bleeding.
Yes.
Or you could take a piece of gut and you could cut either side of the cancer, remove the middle section and connect the two. Right? And it's a fantastic, we've done manually in the past, right? And now the company you bought enabled them to do it through electrical power.
Yes.
Fantastic.
Which is nice. It makes it easier for the surgeon to fire the stapler, and it makes a more consistent staple line because you've got the nice, smooth, steady force being applied throughout the stroke. Yeah.
Yeah, really important. Just as another question, you did your MBA after 8 years of working with a company when you're in this transition period. Were you doing it part-time or did you go off and do it full-time?
So I did an executive MBA. So that in that format is, well, the one we used at the University of Connecticut was you go Friday and Saturday to classes, then you'd have a weekend off, then you would do just a Saturday, then a Friday and a Saturday, kind of that alternating period over 21 months.
I did
and
the
we
same.
had 2 weeks of residency.
And why I'm interested
did the company support you in doing this, or how did this work?
So the company offered a partial tuition reimbursement for that, so they paid part of the bill. I was a veteran, so I got a discount from the state of Connecticut that paid for part of the bill, and then I had to pay the rest. But I had a really supportive boss who didn't charge me vacation time for the Fridays that I was in class, provided I made up the work over the weekend.
Yeah. See, I did the same thing. And then the reason I find this interesting is because this podcast came from a session we did, a day we did with the students of St. Gallen University. And we found that they were, taking a year out to do their MBAs, but they were typically very young. They were late 20s, early 30s, right? And these executive MBAs are happening at a later date. You're still working. And I found that the later MBA, and this is purely just opinion, you brought a lot of experience of how companies work to that MBA. So I got a lot more out of it than if I'd have done it in my early 20s when I didn't really know how the upper layers of the organization were working or thinking. Would you say that? Did you find that same kind of experience? Was it more valuable to you later on, or would you have preferred to have done it when you left the military?
It's a great question, Cash. And ironically, I teach in a part-time MBA program at the University of Connecticut as well.
Fantastic.
So I've been through some courses on educational design, and they talk about kind of the three, as you build a course and you build a curriculum, there's sort of 3 elements you need to build in. There's the interaction between the student and the instructor. There's the interaction between the student and the material, the course packs, the textbook readings, the homework assignments, etc. And then you have to build in peer-to-peer experiences into the course as well. And I think you're absolutely right that the peer-to-peer experiences that I had in my executive MBA program, I think were richer than what I see the peer-to-peer experiences in the part-time program, because as a cohort, the 30-something of us were together for 21 months. We had all the same classes. You really get to know one another. We had some deeply experienced professionals in a variety of different industries. Connecticut here has got a lot of aerospace. So I was in class with a lot of folks that were making jet aircraft engines and helicopters and submarines and those sorts of things. So it was kind of a very group that we had together and a lot of neat experiences.
Yeah, fantastic. Interesting. Right. So you went from an M&A space to say, okay, now I want to be in one of these organizations that, is directly facing the customer.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that one, again, I don't have necessarily the best story in terms of strategic planning for my career, but
I don't think anybody has so far.
My boss's boss came to me and said, "What do you think about Sutures?" And I said, "Sure, I'll take Sutures." And I came home and I remember telling my wife, "I just took a job. I'm now going to be in charge of marketing Sutures." And she said, "But you hate Sutures."
So we're talking about probably the oldest medical device on the planet, right?
Yes.
Piece of string with a needle on it.
And I came in as a supply chain background with 3 years of M&A experience, and I had this view like, why do we have 3,500 reorder codes? It's a needle, a string, and a piece and a bit of packaging. Like, why on earth do we need 3,500 different versions of the same thing?
Yes, I think
I asked a
suture
lot of dumb
specialists
questions.
will hate us right now for what we're saying. We don't mean any disrespect to the product. I mean, it's technologically much further than a piece of string with a needle, but it's a lot of variety of products, right?
It is.
Yeah.
It is.
The,
And,
the most codes in one department of the company that I've ever seen.
oh,
Because
yeah.
you've got types of sutures, absorbable sutures, size of sutures, the needles, straight, bend, curve, the
Single
type
arm,
of
double arm.
points on it. Yeah,
Yep.
exactly. Gosh, yes. So tell us about that. What did you do there? Yeah,
Well, I had a lot to learn, as you
yeah,
just mentioned,
yeah.
about what types of materials are used, why do we use them, and for what different applications, what's going
Yes,
on with the needles. Um,
yes,
there was a lot of very basic education and a lot of
yes,
very patient people because I didn't know an awful lot about the clinical
yeah,
application of suture. And on top of all of that, I inherited the launch of our barbed suture, our V-Lock barbed suture
yes,
device, which was kind of an interesting innovation where you cut little notches into the strand of the suture. And what that meant is you didn't have to tie a knot at the end of the suture.
yeah.
And it offered kind of, it was something new in a product family that is, thousands of years old. I mean, the Egyptians were using sutures. It's that old of a
Exactly.
product line.
Yeah,
Yeah, it was an interesting 5 years of learning the basics of portfolio management.
yes,
We had a number two market share position, but it's a distance number two market share position.
yes,
How do you interrupt or disrupt that market? How do you get surgeons to
yes.
take a new look at an old product? And we
Correct.
identified some things that needed to be done to improve our portfolio. We got some funding to do them. We did a
Yes,
great job on the VLOC launch, and that's where I first met you,
yes,
Josh, right? Is working on the
yes.
VLOC launch and
Absolutely.
sutures and whatnot. And
That was a incredible launch. I mean, it
yeah,
changed the way medicine is practiced in so many different surgical fields. This is, a suture, as you said, has the barbs that once it passes through the tissue in one direction, it can't pass back. So
yes.
as you attach two pieces of tissue together, they're then stuck together, right? They're not going to move, right? And you don't need to tie a knot, which is incredible. Right? You can get into very tight corners. You can speed up the procedure. It was like you said, a revolution in suture.
It is. And, in a traditional suture line, if you kind of map where the tension is, it's at the knots, right? That's where most
Yes.
of the tension is. With a barbed suture, the tension is evenly distributed across the length of the suture, and that has to be better for wound healing.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think for the rest of the company, no one is expecting the biggest or the next big breakthrough to have come from the suture department, right?
No,
Maybe the pacemaker department or the orthopedic department or the robotics, not the suture department.
the suture department. Yeah, no, we did a really nice job with that one.
That was pretty amazing. And now it's universally used worldwide, the VLOC suture.
It is. It is. And ironically, the primary application that we designed it for was around skin closure and in
Yeah.
long plastic surgery procedures. And it's still used there, and it's a very good value there. We kind of, as an afterthought, added some shorter codes that could be used for laparoscopic and robotic suturing. And it turned out for us that was the killer application, was to get that
Yes.
married up with the robot. And as the Da Vinci robot took off, VLOC took off with it. And
Yes.
it almost went viral in the hospital, how quickly once it was in there, everyone that wanted to use that, and they
Yeah.
started in the robotic cases, and then they moved it into their laparoscopic cases. It was a real revolution that way.
I know. It always brings a little smile to my face when I'm in that robotic prostatectomy and the surgeon asks for the VLOC. It's a set step in the procedure, and he turns and
Yes.
says, VLOC. And I always in the background having a little smile on my face, remembering when that was just a new product on the table, figuring out where to sell it.
Yes. Well, and we
Amazing.
very nearly abandoned that launch. There was a threat
Yes.
that if we couldn't get the sales up and going, that they were going to pull the plug and cancel the rest of that launch. So we pulled that one out.
Yeah, that's incredible. But then you went from what some would say is a very basic product in our organization to probably the most complex project that the company had ever launched, right? Which was the robotics area.
Yes.
Yeah. And so that was, I mean, tell me about robotics, how you were one of the pioneers that, you know, yes, there's Intuitive Surgical out there and had been out there for a while developing the market, but the rest of the companies were left far behind, right? And then the company you're working for decided, all right, we're going to get into this market, right? And but they didn't have any technology to start with that, correct?
That's correct. Yeah. So Covidian, about 2012, decided that the robot wasn't just going to go away, and that they needed to have something as an answer to compete with Intuitive over time.
Yes.
And they still stood up a group that started working on the idea. I was aware of them. I was probably much more aware of Intuitive for that time period, because I was riding on their coattails to help us boost the VLOC sales and get them going. But I have a philosophy in my work life that about 4 years is a right length of time you want to spend in a job. That after you hit 4 years, if the company's better off changing leaders to maybe someone who's got a fresh look and a fresh approach, and you're better off kind of in your personal life and your emotional balance and finding a new challenge to look at. So in 2014, I was looking around for a new challenge. And one of my friends had moved over onto the robot project and was saying, Pete, you got to come over here. And while they're at opposite ends of the technology spectrum from a suture to a robot, they're both complex, multifactorial sorts of problems that you have to solve. And suture was really around like, how do I get a whole hospital conversion, and how do I compete with somebody who's got such a dominant market share. And the robots, again, Intuitive had 100% market share because no one else was on the market. How are we going to compete? How are we going to come on the market and get our rightful place? I had that job lined up just before the announcement came out that Medtronic was going to buy Covidian. So I had to wait 6 months for the deal to go through because we had an internal hiring freeze. But literally the first day that Covidian was owned by Medtronic, I moved over and I took my job on the robot team, and did a lot of work there for 8 years.
Yeah, you were.
I have a question before we jump into all this robotic topic. Because in the other interviews, we always talked about networking when finding a new job, but this was all within one company, including acquisitions. How important is internal networking to get through this career, and how did you do it? Because with different departments, sometimes you don't know the colleagues of this department, right? How did you do that?
Yeah, so in this particular case, friend of mine, actually a guy who had worked for me, we're friends. I do still play golf with him after after so many years. He said, "Hey Pete, that we've got an opening that's coming up. You've got to get on this project here. This would be brilliant for you, etc." And so I reached out then to the hiring manager and then the gentleman who was overall in charge of the robot and said, I've got some interest in coming over. Is there a fit? Is there a place, etc. Went over, had a couple of cups of coffee, which effectively became the interviews. And they more or less said, well, the opening is yours if you like it. And unfortunately, this all happened like literally within days of that announcement that the company is going to be bought. So I had everything kind of sewn up. But you're absolutely right. Internal networking is an important thing. You find out where there are openings before they ever get posted. And in this case, I basically had the opening without it ever getting posted.
Yeah. Those interactions that you have in large companies with people from all different departments through the years, it's so important. I mean, you're building your brand, your personal brand throughout those, right?
Yes.
And who you are and what you believe in and how you do things. And I think you were a perfect fit in that robotics because you were multifaceted in your skills. You were also a very calm manager, I got to say, right? It comes across in this interview. You're very paced and calm and working in that surgery field where you're developing something new. And you had the experience of taking on a giant competitor with a new product, right? And making huge inroads into that. So, that was great experience that you brought to the table, as well as having that network as well, that people knew who you were and what you stood for.
Yes.
Really important. And that stands also when you're talking to people outside as well, because with your roles in your M&A type stuff, you are constantly talking to people outside the company. And as you go through the years, you realize it's a small world, right?
It is a small world.
You run into the same people over and over again.
That you do.
Yeah, absolutely amazing. Now, I want to transition a little bit because you've been working on these products that essentially from sutures to robotics, in a surgical company that was specializing in treating people that are on the operating table.
Yes,
And I understand that, at some point you had, I think you hit the magic 50.
I did.
Yeah. And you went for some health checks yourself.
I did. Yeah. So at that time, they since have lowered the screening age because the incidence of colorectal cancer is on the rise, and it's becoming
Right.
younger and younger disease, both globally and in the United States. So now the
Yes,
screening
I
age,
read.
yeah. So now the screening guidelines in the U.S. are 45, but at that time it was
Yeah.
still 50. So I went in
Okay.
for a routine colonoscopy, and when I woke up, I got the news that no one wants to get, which is we found a mass, we've taken a biopsy of this, we'll have the results in a couple of days, but it's more than likely colorectal cancer.
That's a hammer blow.
It's a hammer
How
blow
did that feel?
before Christmas, yes.
Right before Christmas as well. Oh my God. That's fascinating because you spend your whole life in the area of helping people that are in that position. And then you found yourself in that position.
I did.
What do you think, Pete? Is it an advantage or a disadvantage that you knew everything you needed to do following the diagnosis?
That's a great question, Silka. I think for me personally, I'm a person that I tend to do better when I can think things through and visualize and process things. So what was going to happen to me wasn't a mystery. I had been in I'd been in colectomy surgeries before, both robotic and laparoscopic, so I was familiar with the procedure. I knew the techniques that were going to be used. I in the industry, you could know, or you have ways of knowing who's a good surgeon to go to have it done. So I made sure I was going to a very reputable surgeon to have it done. So I think that all kind of helped me intellectually process. And then as a person, I tend to be able to delay my emotional stuff if I can get myself through the logical piece of it. That kind of helps me kind of get through that. So a lot of that 6-month period of surgery and chemotherapy was sort of like you get up and you put one foot in front of the other, et cetera. So knowing what was going to happen, I think helped me an awful lot get through that. It was a tough 6 months though.
But to your point of choosing a surgeon, because they are all your customers, right? So I can imagine you choose one because you trust this person to be the best for you. How do all the other customers react then that you didn't choose them?
What the fortunate piece of that is as a marketing person, I don't have to see them on a regular basis right now.
Okay, you were marketing at that time.
I
Okay,
was a
that's
marketing
easier.
person. As a sales rep, that would have been a much more challenging conversation.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly right. And did that knowledge of the procedure, you knew the results of most of the doctors that in the area, and that logical side, was that a distraction? Did that distract the emotional side? Or
It did. It helped me get through it. Absolutely.
Yeah,
It did.
absolutely. And what about for your family? I mean, I suppose you had to explain to them then what was going to happen, and they were probably wondering why you were calm and not freaking out like I would be, right?
They freaked out more than I did.
Yeah.
But yeah, it helped to be able to explain to my kids and to my wife, this is what's going to happen, and why this is going to be okay.
Yeah. And you were symptom free, right? This only came up through the checking.
Yeah, in retrospect, if I look back at it, I was feeling anemic. My workouts were an increasing slog to get through, which is one of the symptoms of colorectal cancer. But I wasn't seeking screening or treatment for that. I just kind of described it as, okay, you're getting old and lazy, and you just need to knock on through it.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Wow. Fantastic. And then, so you had the chemo, and what was the procedures that you went through then?
Yeah, so I went through chemo starting before COVID. Well, COVID was a thing already, but as the lockdowns happened about halfway through my chemotherapy journey. So I went in, I had the chemo port that, gets implanted in your chest, and I had a regime they call Folfox. And so I would every other week go through a cycle of chemotherapy. So on Tuesdays, I would go to the hospital. I would have to have my blood drawn to make sure I was healthy enough to go through the next round of chemo. I'd have to meet with the oncologist to review the results. I'd have to wait while they pulled the actual prescription for the chemotherapy. And then I had a 2-hour infusion session, and I went home with a pump attached because I had another 48 hours of slow drip infusion of a second chemotherapy agent. And I would have to go back in on Thursdays to have them remove the chemotherapy pump. And then, I would 2 weeks later repeat that same cycle over and over again.
Wow.
So it was an interesting thing. And then when COVID happened, they kind of flipped around the cycle so that we didn't have to spend as much time sitting around and waiting, and we could get some of the pre-screening done. And so we were able to do the oncologist meeting over video visit. But it was an interesting time going through COVID. And I remember sitting, all of these chemotherapy chairs that had been filled, were now empty next to me. And the nurses saying, yeah, we've got patients that are skipping their chemo because they're afraid of getting COVID. And
Wow. Okay.
yeah, it was strange.
Yeah. Wow. And then
And today you're feeling well and
Feeling very well.
you have all the energy for your next chapter we need to discuss, right?
I am. Yes.
that's incredible. I just think that's an incredible story, Pete, that you spent your life dedicated to helping people, and then you end up in the position of those people yourself.
Yes.
And it must have been, when you think about where your career started and the technology that was available then, and when you had your diagnosis, where technology had evolved to, and you played a big part in some of that, right? Which is incredible, right?
Yeah. I mean, you just think of it, the colonoscopy as a widely adopted procedure really only goes back to the 1980s. I mean, the scopes were available 20 years before that, but in terms of this is a tool that we should be using, I remember, the Reagan administration, when President Reagan was screened, they found polyps, and that was a big thing that kind of, drove a lot of people to go get screened. So that's a technology that's 60 years old at the most, widely used for 40 years. Surgical stapling, where they did the anastomosis, and after they took my colon out. Surgical stapling goes back to the 1960s, but laparoscopic stapling only goes back to the 1990s. Chemotherapy regime I'm on is only about 25 years old. So, these are all technologies we think of, where the changes that happen inside of a lifetime, kind of within my lifetime, 3 major technologies that played a big part in saving my life and giving me a good quality of my life were invented or at least moved into broad adoption.
Wow. And you touched some of those technologies. I find that story incredible, and just want to thank you for your vulnerability here and sharing this with us. That's a huge thing. But at the end of the day, that's the main reason why many of us are in the med device industry, right? Because at the end of the day, we're in this to help people that are in that position, right? And
exactly.
And in this case, you also we all end up getting ill at some point, right?
We do.
And wow, I just think that's amazing and huge. And thank you for sharing that.
Sure.
Okay, so then the next chapter, this what was impressive for me. I know that the system in the US is slightly different from the European ones, but still I think most of the people would go back to a corporate environment to feel a little safer, even if it's not really safe today anymore with all the mass layoffs. But you decided to open your own company and to have your own consultancy business. How did that happen? Why did you decide to do your own company?
Yes. So I left Medtronic about a year and a half ago, and I wasn't ready to go back into big corporate medtech. I might at some point in the future do that, but I want to be very selective about where I go. And consulting appealed to me. I had a couple of friends who've done it. So I formed a single person limited liability corporation. I took out a website, surgenticonsulting.com, and I began using my network to reach out to different clients. Along the way, it's led to a couple of seats on boards of directors, a variety of different companies that I've worked with, some startups, some venture-backed, some privately held, a partnership, and some private equity-backed companies, and a variety of different projects. And I really enjoy that you can be selective about the people that you work with and the projects that you take on. I have a passion around reducing costs in healthcare and improving outcomes. And so I try to find work that lets me either help with the affordability and accessibility of medtech, or helps bring innovation and better outcomes to the marketplace with my clients.
Fantastic.
Did you start having already projects in the pipeline, or did you take the full risk when you started your own business?
I had one client lined up, ready to go, and really kind of delayed by a couple of weeks for me to get my paperwork in order so they could contract with me. But it was nice to start with a client lined up. And I did a nice 5-month engagement for them that got me kind of started on things. But after that, I've been kind of rolling on my own.
Wow. So now you have to do your own marketing and your own sales.
And logistics and supply chain. So you're all in one now.
All in one man band.
And I looked on your LinkedIn, so you mainly do either a consulting on projects, but also sit on boards as well,
Yes.
for companies as advising them.
I have been the independent member on one board, and I am the independent member on another board. Yes.
Right. And what does that a role like that entail? What is the company expecting from you in that kind of role?
Well, at a minimum, it's the 4 board meetings a year where you're reviewing, what has happened in the prior quarter, the financials, the progress in coming to market. If it's pre-launch, if it's on the market, what's the progress in getting it adopted? But in
Yes.
practical reality, you're there as a resource for the CEO and the management team. And that resource can be a number of different things. It could be fundraising, and tapping into, angel investors and, helping, preview pitches that they're going to make to groups of investors. It could be taking a little bit of your time to go with them on a visit to a contract manufacturer or to refer them to, hey, there's a marketing agency in my network that has a real specialized skill set that I think you would benefit from. So a lot of it is kind of bringing your wisdom, your experience, and your network to bear to help the business.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, if you're only there once a quarter, you've got to have a good enough knowledge in the business to see, in those snapshots, are they heading in the right direction? Are they presenting the right ideas? Are they doing something that maybe we tried in the past? And here are the watch outs for that from your experience. So, yeah, you got to have a lot of knowledge and skill and experience if you're going to get these 4 snapshots through the year and you need to advise. That's key.
It's a minimum of 4, but if you've got a good relationship with the board and the CEO, it's usually a couple hours a month of, I have a problem I want to run by you, or can you help me out, or is there someone in your network? You have sort of that ongoing advice beyond the 4 formal board meetings.
Yeah. Okay. That sounds quite interesting. And then you can work for several companies at the same time, and you've got your fingers in 7 different technologies, and
Yes,
that must be quite interesting.
it is quite interesting.
Yeah, exactly.
But you said you could imagine to go back to corporate. What could attract you to go back to a corporate position?
I think, Silke, you have to find something that's going to ignite your passion. So the role has to be something that in my case, would have to be an interesting business problem. I consider kind of my career solving, complex multifactorial problems. The more complex, the more factors in play, the more my brain likes to engage with that. So I'd have to find a role that's going to let me, engage with a very interesting problem. The company culture would have to be really good, and supportive. And then you have to feel like whoever your boss is going to be, is somebody that I can work with and that I can trust. And if I could find those 3 things, I'm open to going back to a full-time role, but I'm not in any rush to do it.
Yeah. And your career, as we said earlier, has spanned from Sutures all the way through to robotics. How do you see the next 10, 20 years in the med device industry? What do you think is exciting and developing?
So I think data is probably the most exciting thing that's already underway and continuing to happen. That you have this environment where you have so many different interactions and so many different opportunities to collect data, to use machine learning and artificial intelligence, then to kind of analyze what's going on, and to then apply that to whether you use that in terms of developing a better product, a smart product. You develop better workflows, maybe in a procedure area. But I think there's all sorts of information that's out there today that hasn't been put together in a way that could yield some efficiencies and better outcomes. So I think that's probably the next big trend. The trick is going to be who owns that data, how do we collect it, what are the privacy rights around that, how much do we trust the guidance from the artificial intelligence. So there's a lot of work to do to solve it, but you can see the potential for that. Think of like the robotic surgery, we're now putting a computer between the end effector on the robot and the surgeon that hoovers up all of this information on all the motion of the instruments, how many times was energy activated. I mean, there's the things that were knowable before. It just was the cost of collecting that information and knowing it was too high. But now with the computers in and just kind of hoovering everything. There's somebody out of there and comes into the operating room and it puts all kinds of recording devices, audio and video, et cetera. And they call it the black box, like and a black box in an airplane, et cetera. So you can kind of know every little thing. How many times was the door opened? What percentage of cases had a sales rep in them? I mean, those are just things that were knowable. It just was so expensive to know them. And now that we can know them, we can use this machine learning and figure out, are there better ways of doing things? So I think
Yeah,
it's a cool time ahead of us.
absolutely. This is definitely a very cool time, and it's happening very rapidly,
Very rapidly.
right? I know it's making us ask questions that we never consider. I mean, surgical stapling, as we've mentioned, been around for decades, right?
Right.
Now we could even look at, well, what is the pressure being applied when the stapler comes down, and could we correlate that pressure to healing time and healing outcomes, right? Those kind of things, we never asked those questions before, right? But now with the technology we have today, we could look at them.
Absolutely possible. Yes.
It's an
Cool
exciting
stuff.
time.
Very cool stuff.
So we come to our very final question, which we always ask is, what are the 3 things you know now that you wish you had known then?
Well, okay. That's a tough question. I'll start off with one is just the work-life family balance piece of that. We talk a lot about that. There is so much pressure, especially in your 20s and 30s and 40s to get things done. And you do crazy things. I mean, I was on my laptop from my chemotherapy chair logging into work to make sure that I was on top of everything that was going on. And I can honestly say that, you don't look back at the career 20 or 30 years on and say, well, how many weekends did I work or whatnot? You kind of look back and say, well, how good was the life that I lived? Was I there enough for my wife and kids? Did I take that extra day on a business trip and go see the Taj Mahal? Or did I just see the inside of a conference room, et cetera? So I think one is it's important to slow it down and to make sure that you don't kind of get too unbalanced in favor of work and that work-life balance. It's important. It's a balance, but we have a tendency, at least in the United States, to skew towards the work half of that balance and become unbalanced. The second thing is just sort of let things breathe. There is a tremendous pace of life in corporate corporate life in big med tech. We want to get it done. We want to get it done. And there's a healthy aspect to that urgency, but sometimes, particularly with some of these big strategic decisions, just kind of let it breathe. I think I mentioned earlier when we were talking about the V-Lock Barb suture device that Cash and I were under some pressure. They almost canceled that launch. And now look at it. I mean, it's I think $100 million product line for the company at a very attractive margin. But you have to have a little bit of patience, particularly when you're launching something that's new, that's disruptive. That takes a little bit of time to build out the acceptance in the marketplace and maybe even an ecosystem around it. So kind of you give things a little bit of time to breathe before you jump in and start making changes or panicking. And then the third thing is just look at the bigger picture. I think we get in MedTech, we get very focused on things. We had the opportunity to go to a healthcare congress a couple of weeks ago that was focused on CEOs. And the CEOs, when you looked at all of the topics they were after, they were worried about Medicare patients and honoring their mission in the community. How do we take care of folks that don't have health insurance when they show up in the emergency room? And I've got to be solvent, et cetera. And I'm there because I want to talk about surgical robots, right? And they're like, oh, I think I might own one. I couldn't tell you which vintage it is or who made it. And you get to that realization, okay, there's a lot bigger picture. So, how does my product fit, first within the intended, therapy area, but then how does that therapy area fit as a service line within the practice, the hospital, and kind of where does this sit in the whole ecosystem? I think we're guilty a lot of tunnel vision and maybe not kind of fully understanding that whole healthcare ecosystem that we're a part of. And I think there's an advantage in understanding that ecosystem because then you both better market your product and you also then have an idea around what other stuff could I bring to the marketplace besides just the tech that I'm bringing right now? Where are there other opportunities to disrupt this?
That's fantastic. Stellar advice. Well, all I can say at this stage is, hey, Pete, thank you very much. I'm going to thank you first for all the advice and support you gave me during my career. It was always valued. You were always my go-to person in GSP and then later on robotics because you are that calm person that lets it breathe and sees the longer picture. And you've always given me great advice. So thank you for that. And also thank you today for sharing your career, your journey, and especially your personal journey with your cancer diagnosis. That was very brave of you. Thank you very much for that. It's been an absolute pleasure for me to share this time with you again today.
Well, it's been an absolute pleasure, Cash. You're welcome for all that. And I also want to say thank you because throughout my time working with you, you've been one of the folks that inspires me to take a little bit more risk, to be a little bit more creative and innovative. And It's always been a fun experience working around you. You have just this most wonderful, creative, and energetic mind and approach to doing business. It's fun to work with you.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you for tuning into our MedTech Lives. You have been listening to Zilka Rima and Tash Ikram. We're committed to bringing you insights and stories that inspire and inform the medical community. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with your network.